Hey, kids, and welcome to Conscious Embodiment, Astrology, and Dreams with Dr. Michael Lennox, coming at you for May 29th, end of May. Cannot believe May's already over. This is that moment in the year. I don't know if you have this experience or not, Joe, but this is the moment in the year where I get overwhelmed with how fast everything feels like it's going.
Yeah, you're like,
because, the
half
new year feels like it
over?
was just behind. Right, exactly. We're almost at half the year over. So we're actually at a kind of completeness with the biggest bumps that April and May brought to us. The fixed Grand Cross is officially over. And so we're in a little bit of a gentler landscape than we've been in. But before we get into that, two things. One is it's the fifth Monday. May has 5 Mondays. And whenever there's a fifth Monday, I interview somebody. And we've got my pal Joe Weston coming in the second half of today's podcast. And he's doing such beautiful and important work right now on the planet with regard to confrontation and polarization and how to move our way through a world gone mad in a manner that I have absolutely no ability to sort of speak into or teach. But Joe's doing really beautiful work on the planet, and he's got a new book coming out. I can't wait to introduce you all to Joe.
And that
Weston.
work feels so relevant right now, at least in our country, the United States of America.
So relevant. Yeah. And I talk about this all the time in my own work, that this idea of standing comfortably in the dissonance of disagreement. I can't teach you how to do that better. What I can teach people how to do is to have less dissonance inside themselves so that when they are in difficult situations like that, there's a bit better ability to be graceful. But I can't teach you how to do that, but Joe can. We also have a question. I always love our Astro questions. And Emmy wrote in and asked a great question. I've sort of been waiting for somebody to ask about this. So Emmy writes, this is about astrology. Can you talk about a planet being Cazimi? I have heard other astrologers use this term, and I am not sure how or if it's different than being exact.
Oh, yeah, you've mentioned this before. I've heard you say this word, but only once. It doesn't really come up.
Because I don't truck with a lot of classic astrology stuff, even though I know it and I learned it, and I talk about this a lot. It's like, just because you learned it in a book doesn't mean that it's viable and valid. And then I talk about my body and my sensitivity and 30 years of checking astrology through the lens of my body. Cazimi is one of those ancient astrology, air quotes, rules that to me is no longer valid, not because of what Cazimi is, but because of what combust is. And you don't get Cazimi without combust. So let me sort of break all of this stuff down.
Is this a case of we have more science tools now?
Kind of. That's actually exactly right. We have more science. We have more expanded awareness into things that centuries ago were a complete mystery. And therefore, the superstitious approach when we didn't know anything doesn't apply because of science and knowledge.
Got it.
So, traditional astrology says that when a planet comes into contact with the sun, it becomes what's called combust. So if a personal planet, Venus, Mars, or Mercury, swipes by the sun, then that planet's consciousness is just considered to be eradicated by the overwhelming power of the sun's bright, burning rays. Now, think about the world 500 years ago. We didn't know from the sun, right? We didn't know what it was. For a while, we thought that that it spun around us. We had no idea what the sun was, but we knew that it was bright and burning. So it would make sense to think or imagine that if the planet Venus that brings love is near the sun, that love is going to be burnt up, combust, not available to us.
That math's for me.
Well, it makes sense when you consider the superstitious worldview hundreds of years ago when it's like, of course, the sun would burn up anything. So cazimi is a fabulous word, first of all. I wish we could say it more because it's a fabulous word. Yes. Cazimi represents the moment when a planet conjuncting the sun is at the very deep center of that conjunction, kind of like an eye of the storm. Like in a hurricane, it's all chaos and wind. And then at the very center of the storm, there's this clarity, stillness. There's a 17-minute swath of space inside of a conjunction. Minutes are portions of degrees. There's 60 minutes in every single degree, kind of like minutes and seconds and minutes and hours, but distance, space instead of time. So at the very center of this conjunction, if, say, Venus in this case is crossing this tiny little swath of space where the sun also is, that's considered cazimi. And for the few hours that the planet is crossing this very sensitive inner eye of the storm of the conjunction, then the planet's power, the transiting planet, in this case I'm talking about like transiting Venus, is thought to be available, and the conjunction has some power within that moment. Now, I'll add a second distinction about cazimi that also makes this confusing, because what I just described is my understanding of classical cazimi. A tiny little portion within a conjunction of a tiny little bit of space where only during the moments when that planet is in that tiny little piece of space, cazimi exists. And there's a whole bunch of astrologers who just replace cazimi for conjunction, and they call the whole thing of the planet conjuncting the sun cazimi. Well, right there is that's a dichotomous approach to what cazimi is that eradicates both definitions. Right, so right there, it's like, all right, stop talking about cazimi because 50% of you think it's one thing and 50% of you think it's another thing. And me, here alone in my little way that I approach modern astrology, says that now we know what the sun is made of. We now know where exactly it is, how it operates. We've seen it. We've been close. We look at it through telescopes. We've watched Venus or Mercury cross across the sun's surface with our fucking little eyes. So to me, that makes the idea of combust a superstitious approach to the past, and therefore cazimi as not valuable to a modern perspective of using astrology. And the last thing I'll say is, for the person who's not a full-time astrologer, who's just turning to astrologers like me to use a tool that they're learning more about to contextualize their lives, cazimi's not going to make a difference to your life on a Tuesday when Venus is conjuncting the sun and you're like thinking about how am I becoming consciously aware of the greater desire to give and receive love, sun, and Venus in conjunction. And now some astrologer is going to tell you to think about cazimi, and I'm like, oh, please do not bother unless you want to become an astrologer and understand the history of astrology deeply and explore ancient rules that don't apply to our modern world, and so let it go. But at least now you know what cazimi is, and you can decide whether it has any, value for you to consider in a moment where cazimi is present. And as an astrologer for 30 years, I can tell you that I don't. That's why I don't mention it, and that's why I don't teach about it. And I've been waiting for somebody to ask me this question. Thank you, Emmy. So it is indeed a little bit quieter. The fixed Grand Cross, really as of last weekend, came to a close. Friday of last week, Mars squared the nodes of the moon. That was the last 90-degree geometry of the fixed Grand Cross, where Pluto in Aquarius is carrying, death, rebirth, level of change and transformation. The south node of the moon is carrying the past we're looking to move away from. Mars, current level of action and movement, was what was generating the cross in the first place. So we were bumping into walls, facing obstacles and conflicts. And then the fourth corner of the square was Jupiter, North Node, Mercury, Uranus, and the Sun when the Sun was in Taurus. So all of that constricting conflict, bumping into the wall energy, by the time we got to Saturday-ish of this past weekend, was floating into our rear view mirror. So as we move into this week, Monday, May 29th, we got Sun in Gemini, so we're in connection, ideas, the sharing of same, the desire to, socialize and interact in a lighter way. That helps the atmosphere be a little bit lighter. Got Mercury in Taurus and way out of his retrograde, finally moving at his normal pace. So communication is in the heart, nice and grounded and steady. Venus is in Cancer and she's fine here. We're probably a little more emotional and tender as a result. Mars is in Leo, past the square, so he's no longer bumping us up against conflict and obstacles. Mars in Leo in general is extroverted in our actions, very focused on self-expression and creative projects and impulses. Lots of great leadership is stimulated with Mars in Leo. And all of these personal planets are free to deliver what they deliver us without the extra, constrictions of the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, depending on how far back you want to look. It's been a clusterfuck, kids, and this is the first week I can officially say it is truly behind us.
Amazing.
Yes, no,
it's just week after week. You're like, well, new conflict. Yeah. Okay, other conflict.
That's right. And there's something happening right in the middle of this week that's a little bit like a thrust forward after moving through all kinds of constricted possibilities of delay, breakdown, and problems of the last couple of weeks. And this is driven by the planet Jupiter, who has recently moved into Taurus, conjuncting the north node of the moon, also obviously in Taurus. The north node is that collective point that we all share that represents our North Star, the direction that we're moving in, the goals and desires for our future that we're sort of holding up as vision of where we want to go next. That's the North Node's consciousness. Jupiter, of course, says we can have anything we desire as long as we have the talent to, accommodate the demands of it, that we have a sense of deserving, that we, deserve it. And Jupiter in Taurus amplifies that for each of us, right? Taurus really is the cash and prizes sign and the deserving sign. It's a Venus-ruled sign that says our hearts deserve to have everything we could possibly desire. Jupiter says, I'll bring you those cash and prizes, and we get to enjoy this manifestation into form with Jupiter in Taurus for the next 11 months. And while he's been there for a couple of weeks now, we haven't really been able to enjoy a sense of forward thrust, because even though it's been in the mix, simultaneously, there's been all of this drag on the system from these 90-degree squares that have been left, right, and center. So the squares are behind us. Jupiter and the North Node come together this week and sort of signal a moment of movement forward and a sense of flow with regard to the desires that we've been carrying in our hearts for a while. If you listen to this podcast every week or follow me in other ways on a regular basis, you know that we talked about the idea that as we left 2022 and came into 23, Jupiter was moving into Aries, which is that cardinal fire sign that gets us started in earnest. And so that was a moment of movement, action, and motivation to get our projects, our desires, our goals up and running. But if you remember also, simultaneously, we entered this year with a Mars retrograde saying, nope, there's things about our embodiment that needs all sorts of unconscious adjustments. And just as we finished that, we sort of inched through eclipse season and Mercury retrograde and these grand crosses slowing us down. And here comes a moment of now we get to move forward. I'm going to say unimpeded, but of course, I don't really mean that because there's always movement and there's always impedance. But
life is life.
Certainly, Jupiter and the North Node coming together signal a moment of flow or movement after, I think, a couple of months of false starts and challenges with movement. Now, would that were all that were going on this Wednesday, in the beautiful way that astrology offers us contradictions that we then have to interpret into, there's something important happening between Mars, the planet of action, and Saturn, the great teacher, on the same day this coming Wednesday. So remember that Mars has just been taking us through some blockages, obstacles, and lessons, and the need to sort of figure out how we're going to accomplish things once we have a little difficulty thrown into the mix. That's the last 2 weeks. So if we anthropomorphize Mars at this moment, it's like he's got it. He's been downloaded with all the problems he needed to solve. Now that he's figured out what needs to be worked on, today he moves through the great eliminator angle with Saturn, the great teacher. So that's a transit that says, all right, I'm ready to move forward, at least theoretically, but the teacher is saying one more pass through the exit mechanism. Are you absolutely on the right path? Is there anything that you got hinted at in the last few weeks that needs to change, that you've been in resistance of letting go of? Like, this is a reckoning moment. It's fast moving. It doesn't have a lot of weight, but it's happening at the right and precise time where Jupiter is saying, look how great the future can be, Jupiter North Node. And Saturn, the teacher, says, all right, wait, before you get too excited, I need you to spend a little bit of time this week thinking about and feeling into, is there anything that you've got to let go of in order to move more powerfully forward with that vision that should be lighting up for you this week with Jupiter and the North Node coming together? Mars and Saturn are adding to that sort of Klieg light of, focusing on where we're going, with a demand to just take some stock this week and let go of anything that is in the way of you moving more powerfully towards your desires. I love the elegance of astrology because I just described a powerful way that the week is going to lead us through experiences, both internal and circumstantial, potentially, where we will become aware of what the next release has to be. What's the garbage we can't carry forward? What do we got to let go of so that we're lighter as we trek into the next chapter? And the peak of that energy happens like Wednesday, and then Saturday we move through a full moon, which means we're ready to do yet another release from the unconscious of whatever, ideas are inhibiting us from moving more powerfully, like every full moon brings. So the sun is in the Gemini mansion, so our conscious awareness is focused on our ideas, our connections, our social circles, and how we sort of talk our way through the lives that we create. The opposite sign, Sagittarius, is where we're in consideration of our higher truths that guide us. Gemini invented ideas. Sagittarius takes ideas and turns them into complex, higher consciousness, thought forms. So when we're in a full moon where the sun is in Mercury-ruled Gemini and our conscious awareness is on how we are thinking and perceiving, a full moon in Sagittarius asks us, or maybe allows us, is a better way of putting it, allows us to let go of the lower, distracting, anxious, monkey mind thoughts that get in the way of us knowing the truth of ourselves as magnificent, beings of having a spiritual experience in a human body. How we perceive our world is sort of the lens through which everything can come or cannot come to us, right? If you want to create abundance for yourself, but you look out in the world and all you see is, your own poverty, it's going to be difficult for you to create more abundance if your perceptions are stuck through your fearful lenses. And that's a powerful thing that gets released in a Sagittarius full moon, because we're opting for the higher truths to guide us. And of course, everything that happened 3-4 days before Saturday's full moon is funneled right into the capacity of the full moon to help us release things from the unconscious realms. So that means Jupiter's conjunction to the North Node is still fully in force during this full moon, which means that everything that we do focus on and allow to be removed from our unconscious experience is going to be directly dialed in to the vision we are holding for our future. It's dialed right into this full moon, really powerfully, because Jupiter is hanging out with the North Node when that full moon is exact. Mercury has caught up to Uranus, and they are conjunct during this full moon. So the sun in Gemini does mean that Mercury is kind of featured this whole month, because that's what it means to have the sun in a certain mansion. Mercury rules the whole passage of sun in Gemini. So in a full moon with the sun in Gemini, to have Mercury and the Great Awakener right next to each other means that our thoughts are like little pivot machines. This will help us revolutionarily change our focus or change our perspective in the manner that the full moon lets us let go of lower vibrational ideas that we call truths that are really just fearful thoughts masquerading as truth that we listen to and we shouldn't, and this full moon helps us let go of. And Mercury right near the lightning flash planet of Uranus in the Venus-ruled sign of Taurus says, if there's anything unlike love still stuck in your voice, we can zip it out with a little psychic surgery that this full moon can bring. There's a very beautiful trine between Venus in Cancer and Neptune in Pisces. This is a transit that rises up on Friday, so that does mean we finish the work week, if you work Monday to Friday, in a very lovely, open-hearted sensibility. Venus is love in the heart, Neptune is love of the divine, and when they are in a 120 triangle, then love is love is love is love, and it's flipping everywhere. And because Venus is in Cancer, we get to download that divine love right into our hearts. So our emotional body and our heart centers will be so wide open this whole weekend from Venus trining Neptune on Friday, allowing the full moon to really chop some shit off in our unconscious territory, which we will allow because our hearts will feel safe. So, as you move through this week, let the middle of the week inspire you from a visionary sense. Where do I want to go? Some examination of what needs to be dropped in order for you to get there. Remember, Saturn likes to reward. I'm talking about the Mars in conjunct Saturn piece, right? So that transit of dropping behaviors that no longer serve, we've been doing the work. This isn't good, like there's not a surprise here of what to focus on.
Right.
You allow the mind and perceptions to be available for sudden shifts and changes with Mercury and Uranus next to each other. And mostly trust that the heavy lifting of the last 2 months really has generated changes in our inside landscapes. And this really is a moment when we're letting go of way more than we can even be aware of because there's been so much deep work in the last 2 months. So just trust and allow that the high-minded thoughts that the Sagittarius archetype brings, full moon in Sagittarius, ruled by Jupiter, that this really and truly is that full moon that allows us to let go of a big chunk of consciousness that we've been working on for a couple of months and drop it by the side of the road so that we can move more powerfully towards our heart's desires. It's a big full moon, but not like the crazy ones of the last 2 months. But it does allow us to do the deep work. Trust that and have at it.
Did you know that Michael has a daily astro alert? If you enjoy hearing the weekly astrology, you might like knowing more about each day. When you subscribe for the daily astro alerts, you'll get an in-depth explanation of the day's astrology sent right to your email. Subscriptions are only $10 a month, or you can purchase the yearly subscription at the reduced price of $100. To subscribe, head over to michaellennox.com. All right, it's dream segment time. Every week, Dr. Michael will interpret dreams that are sent in via email or take a live caller. If you would like your dream interpreted on the podcast, you can go ahead and email us at dreams@michaellennox.com. Hopefully your dream will make it onto the show.
Well, we have 5 Mondays in the month, kids. And when we have 5 Mondays in a month, I always devote the 5th and final week to an interview. I grab somebody in my life who's doing interesting work, and I have got an interesting conversation for us to have. I'm going to introduce you folks to a pal of mine who's a colleague and doing some really brilliant work, a gentleman named Joe Weston. But before I introduce Joe, I'm gonna say this, and if you've been following me with any appreciable amount of time, you may have heard me talk about this thing about the state of affairs on the planet at the moment. We're at war out there, no doubt about it, and I do not know how to fix that. I am not a person who can picture myself out there having difficult conversations when faced with someone who believes differently than I do. It's not what I focus my work on. I know how to help people end the war inside of themselves so that there's less likely to be a war outside of us that we can't sort of fix and solve and bring peace to. And my friend Joe Weston knows all about this. So let me bring him in. Joe's a resilience coach, an executive mentor, a transformational leadership facilitator, which is all sorts of fancy words that he's going to describe what that means. So, Joe Weston, say hello to my audience and let's talk about confrontation out there.
Hi there. Hi, Michael. It's great to be here with you. It's great to speak with your listeners, and I love sharing all of this work. So let's get to it.
How about this? Your work for years was described by the phrase respectful confrontation. That's accurate? Now,
Right.
you have a new
Yes,
book out, which
that's
we're
correct.
going to talk about a great detail when we get a little further in, called Fierce Civility. I love that title. But talk to us first. What is respectful confrontation? How did you present a kind of teaching to the world? What did it involve? And let's start with that.
Yeah. So there's a lot of ways that avenues to discuss that. Respectful confrontation is something I developed. I mean, I've been working on it all my life, but I had my first workshop on it in the Bay Area in 2005, and it's a method and a practice that helps you to stand in your power,
Yeah.
speak your truth,
Yeah.
get your needs met in a way where you don't get harmed and other people don't get harmed. And what I was seeing, I've been tracking that all my life just to see what one of the fundamental questions that I've always had growing up. So I grew up in New York City. That's where I was born, and I always say that growing up in New York City is every day is an examination of
Yes, it's
confrontation and
indeed. It's
conflict.
it's the great experiment in New York City, isn't it? Yeah.
It's certainly an experiment.
Yes.
It's like forced intimacy with millions of people. And there's a benefit to that. You really learn that you to survive, you have to engage with strangers. Whether you do that well or not is another question, but you have to. And I grew up my childhood was very volatile, a lot of fighting, a lot of arguing. Also, my dad spent some time in jail when I was
Okay.
around 12 years old. And
Well, that's
that
it,
was
because,
just some of
my
the
second
story. I mean,
question would
that's
be
that's
like, "Tell me
yeah.
about your childhood, Joe. Where did the work
Good.
start?" And obviously it
Yes.
started right there in the crucible of your family.
Yeah, yeah. And it started with this basic question that in the midst of all that, even though I was forced to fight, right? That was just what boys
Yeah, we're
certainly, or
expected
most
to
of us
do. Mhm.
were expected to do. I still had this question that has been with me all my life, which is why is it even though we know better? Now, I love to say this. We can see close-up pictures of Pluto, my favorite planet, I have to say. We can see
That's
into the
right.
smallest of atoms. We have all the information we need at our
Yeah.
fingertips, and yet why is it that even though we know better, we still have arguments and fights? And that has
Mm.
always been my question through all of everything I've done, working through my own childhood trauma, luckily being introduced to Tai Chi, which opened up me connecting to mind body connection and
Oh,
understanding the world
wow.
through Taoist principles and Eastern philosophies. I ended up in the Netherlands, where I lived for 18 years, where I met my Tibetan Buddhist teacher, Geshe Sonam Gyaltsen, where I had a chance to, in very deep ways, study the wisdom of Tibetan Buddhism and mostly the practices around developing the compassionate heart. So, compassion and wisdom has been always my
Mm.
thing, basically, you could say. And I decided to come back to the States around, well, one of the impetuses, there were many reasons, was the United States invading Iraq in 2003.
Mm.
And that just broke my heart. And I said, maybe I need to go back to the States to see if there's something I can do to contribute. Instead of just being an expat complaining about the US, I wanted to go back to see if there was something I could do.
And so in that moment when there was great sort of conflict and calamity here in the States, you was that visionary for you, that you had a sense of that your next calling was to bring that wisdom into your home base?
Yes, and specifically the message that we got, that was an opportunity. What happened in 9/11, I don't want to go too much, we don't need to go too much into
Yeah,
it, was an opportunity for us to evolve out of our typical
yeah.
fight, flight, freeze response and find global unity. We had global unity. I read about this in my new book. For a day or two or a week, the world was united. Most of the world was united in solidarity for what had happened in the US. That was an opportunity for us to move into new ways of engaging with each other.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, American leadership decided to say the policy was you're either with us or you're against us,
Mhm.
basically solidifying even deeper levels of
Yes.
polarization.
Yes.
And so by coming back, I wanted to open that up. And also on a personal level, having now been involved with a lot of spiritual communities, a lot of communities that are doing good for charity organizations, Dharma centers, seeing that when people were at their best, they were really in heart resonance, but that as soon as it became about who's going to clean the toilets or who's going to send out the mailing,
yes.
then it devolves back into why is it even though we know better, we have arguments and
Yes.
fights? And I wanted to address that question.
And it's so fast that that devolving. So did the respectful confrontation workshops emerge up out of that desire? Where did you and how did you start working with groups, and what were you bringing to those groups in terms of, experience and education?
Well, so it started with open enrollment, self development, because just the last piece of that is that I also encountered people in around the world who had great gifts, great talents, great intellect, who had something to offer that the planet so badly needs, but wasn't finding their way to empower themselves to be able to step into that. Yeah. That's why I developed the respectful confrontation. Because in order to do that, you have to stretch beyond what's comfortable into the uncomfortable. And a lot of the work I bring in neuroscience now, which is that a nervous system with chronic stress or trauma can't delineate between what's unsafe and what's uncomfortable. So that's one of the reasons why we devolve so quickly, is that as soon as we're in an uncomfortable situation, as soon as we are confronted, for instance, with people who are different or have different views, we are in an uncomfortable state. And if we think it's unsafe, then we're just going to devolve into those patterns.
I'm gobsmacked right here, just on this Tuesday morning that we're recording this podcast, because I had a conversation this morning with some folks that you actually know, Joe, in our circles I did some work with. We were literally speaking specifically about the distinction between uncomfortable and unsafe. And since my work is very much with individuals one-on-one, even my class work, it's ultimately about that individual's process. Can you talk a little bit more about this distinction between these two states and how people might begin to discern the difference between them if they're just beginning to take a look at their own embodiment and their own sort of information that their body transmits to them?
Yeah, well, I won't get too much into the neuroscience of it, but basically, the wonderful thing about our reptilian brain and the autonomic nervous system is it keeps it safe.
Yeah.
There's a lot of wisdom. It gets a bad rap as being primitive, but it's actually, it's got a lot of wisdom. And when we're in a trauma state or we're too much in our heads, in our neocortex, we don't trust that. So a lot of the work you do, a lot of the work I do, and a lot of the work people we know is and the basis of respectful confrontation is learning to get back inside yourself and learn the vocabulary of the heart and the vocabulary of the body, because the vocabulary of the wisdom of the heart and the wisdom of the body will always inform you to do what is best for you at that moment. It will never deceive you.
Right. It's designed to keep us safe and in
yeah. The reptilian brain as well. And so, but we don't listen, we don't trust those signals. We're moving too quickly where we can't even hear them, or we hear them and we don't know the language. We can't interpret the vocabulary, or we don't trust it as valid information.
Yeah. Or we don't stop to ask. A lot of the work that I do with people teaches people to ask their own unconscious what's below, what's going on below the surface, what more might there be to learn about this moment. But that does require a slower pace when the response and reactivity mechanism would have us reacting fast, when the best thing to do might be to slow down and say, well, what am I feeling? Where in my body am I feeling it? And what does that offer me in terms of wisdom and information?
And that was my desire through embodied work, through the 4 pillars of resilient power that I developed, and through understanding the dynamics. So I use martial arts as a metaphor in respectful confrontation from my background, not to kick and punch people to get what you want and speak your truth, but on the contrary, to learn the dynamics, to be able to, like what you learn in martial arts is you learn how to take a punch in a sense. You learn, you train your system to be able to stay present to attacks that are coming to you in a sense, and then have effective decision making to then make the appropriate decisions in that moment. So much of the harm we do to one another is, of course, unconscious.
Yeah.
It's through words, it's through gestures, it's through power games, it's passive aggression. So it's not kicking and punching, but the respectful confrontation and the fierce civility work train you. It's an upgraded communication model, like a martial arts or sports training. You're learning to train your system to hold higher levels
Yeah.
of stress and tension so that you can stay in your heart. Because what I believe, Michael, is that, and that's the whole basis, the reason why I felt compelled to write Fear Civility, is that I'm involved with so many think tanks right now, and I follow all that, the research and the money that's being spent to come up with solutions to our world problems. They're brilliant,
Mm.
but they're never going to be implemented. Why? Because everybody on this planet is suffering from some level of chronic stress,
Yeah.
trauma, whether
Yes.
that's personal trauma, generational trauma, um, cultural trauma. And as long as we're in that trauma state, we are anything that we perceive as different or new, we're going to perceive as a
As a
threat,
threat,
maybe
yeah.
to our
You know,
lives.
you're gobsmacking me with this image of the martial arts discipline teaching you how to receive a hit and still moving forward in flow. And as someone who, I mean, Joe, it took decades for me to heal the reactive mode of, like, if I even think you're gonna criticize me, I will take you out.
Yes,
Right?
yes,
And then
yes.
even after I healed the behavior of that decades ago, and I was able to move through the world as an adult that wasn't causing more problems than I was, solving, I still had the inner sense of, I feel attacked, and then my impulse, of course, is to attack back because that's what worked in my family of origin. When my brother was
Right,
beating me up, I could attack him verbally and make him feel ashamed, and I did that for decades with other human beings, so I love
right.
that image. I wanna ask a question that I don't think will be too bizarre. I'm gonna ask you to hearken back to the years before the pandemic. So 8,
Yes.
17, 18, 19.
That you're taking me way back. You're taking me way far back. That's pretty far back. Go
Well, it's before the world
ahead.
changed, that's for sure. I'm just curious, were you, based on the work that you were doing with groups all over the world, training people in these modalities that you came up through this work, were you hopeful?
That's a great question. Yes, I always say I may not be very optimistic about what's been unfolding and what's going to unfold, but I'm very hopeful,
I love that.
and I'm very hopeful
I love that.
because I have faith in the human spirit.
Yeah, as do
And
I.
and and
Yeah.
despite all that, I mean, the things that I've experienced. So when I started doing, I was saying when I did the first open enrollment workshop in 2005, it was for individuals. But then I started getting invited to organizations, as you were
Yeah,
asking,
yeah.
and NASA is one of them. I've done trainings with them for over 10 years.
Ooh, smell
And
you. How fun.
I want to do my first training up on the moon.
That's
We'll see
right,
if that
baby. I think
works.
you should parlay that into a workshop, up there.
That would be fun. You could come and you can be
Thank
part
you.
of that if you want.
That's right. We'll look at the stars.
And then Pluto after that. Anyway, I'm going to see how many times I can bring up Pluto in the conversation.
Well, we're going to talk about Pluto in just a
Okay.
moment. So,
Okay,
but
great.
we have to get forward. So, you were feeling mildly hopeful.
And then I also, as you know, I've mentioned, I work with incarcerated men in a California state prison. I've
Yeah.
worked with severely wounded combat veterans.
Yeah.
I've done many years of working with women's rights organizations in the Middle East. And to just see their spirit, their resilience of those different groups, to see them, some of them with panic, particularly the veterans, open to ideas of coming into your core and opening your heart, to see them transform and open, to go through that process
Yeah.
of being in that high level of uncomfortable and make it through to the other side. And that Michael, is what actually brings me hope, is that both respectful confrontation and fierce civility is not about how do we get along. It's not about how do we agree to disagree,
Maybe how
which is
we
the most
don't get along, maybe.
but not, it's not that the goal isn't let's just get along or
Right.
let's just
No,
agree to
right,
disagree, right?
correct.
Because that's not solving any
No,
problems.
that
That's
doesn't
just
solve anything.
reinforcing.
No, that just makes the afternoon more comfortable.
Exactly. But to be able to know that and you know this from your work and from what's emerging with the planets, I would say, is that the solutions that are going to get us through this are currently emerging, and they
Ooh.
need and to be an emergent creation, it's a messy, uncomfortable process. It's not civil. it's not with drinking tea and biscuits. It's messy, and therefore we need the skills to stay in the messy and to stay in that process, to stay in that flow, to stay in the balance, to be able to move through and to be in that collective space. And it needs to be with diverse voices. It needs, because the solutions that we're coming up with only work for some people, and then they get torn down. So the solutions that are going to be lasting, to lead to lasting peace, and this is if I may say, this is an image I hold. Imagine if all the solutions to our world problems already reside within us, and somehow they got fragmented like a jigsaw puzzle, and every disparate group is holding on to a different piece of the
Yeah, it's a different
puzzle.
piece of the puzzle. We got to come together to create the image.
Yeah.
Joe, you've gobsmacked me for a second time in our conversation of this idea that the solutions to the current problems are in fact emerging. I get that completely, instantaneously, and it's not a thought I have had before you mentioned it.
Wow.
So that is a gobsmacking thought, to just acknowledge that part of the discomfort of the time is that we are in fact birthing new ways of being in community and interaction because we have to. So thank you for the second little gobsmack. So now take us through what the pandemic brought to your consciousness and how that led to fierce civility.
Well, I was actually writing it before the pandemic, and I had to keep rewriting because the world kept changing, so it wasn't making any sense. And then George Floyd happened, and this country, and a lot of it was happening. And that was a time when I said, I don't want to write as a white man. I just want to listen.
Okay.
I don't want to share. And just finding and working through my own trauma of being in the pandemic and dysregulation. And in that time, I was offering a lot of trainings to people in a world where we feel so uncertain and there's so much anxiety, and we don't feel like we necessarily have control of our external forces. Where do we have power? And where we always have power is is regulating our nervous system, cultivating resilience, and cultivating authentic relationships with other people. So, but the work was still always there, that sense of, and it's all about the heart. So, in this idea of, if we're all in this chronic fight, flight, freeze response, and we can't perceive, and anything we perceive as new or different, we're going to perceive as a threat, maybe to our lives, it shuts down our hearts.
Yeah, yeah.
And basically, that's my work is an appeal to the heart. It's always been that, and it's only become stronger because of the pandemic. Because we have now systematized, in a sense, engaging virtually, in a sense, that we're not being in rooms with
we're not
each
in the
other.
room.
We're not.
Yeah.
We're not. I always say we're not breathing the same oxygen. We're not doing heart resonance with one another.
Correct.
And that's a concern I
That
have.
is, yep.
And so therefore, this is all about where none of those solutions are going to work until we can train ourselves to feel safe when we open our hearts, and to appeal to others to open theirs.
That's really interesting, Joe, that without being present in the room, we can't rely on the physical experience of proximal heart regulation, which happens in groups, as you well know. It's partly
Right.
how we make group experiences so powerful, is
Right.
a resonance sort of lining up.
Yeah, so that's a concern I have, that is this idea that now, because of the pandemic, we're now getting used to, or we're systematizing, it's okay to relate to people virtually. And yes, it makes it more easy and convenient. But what we're forgetting is that the human body, the human brain, the human
We
nervous system, the human
respond.
part is not built that way.
That's right. We're built to be near each other and impact each
Yes.
other.
The electromagnetic field, the nervous system regulation, how we engage with each other.
So it's really important that we all learn how to do this for ourselves at a much higher level in this brand new age that we're moving into.
Yes, even more so. Even more so.
So astrology, Joe, because Joe is a
Yes.
bona fide astrologist in his own right. He knows a lot, and is often interacting with me via email around big astro moments. Certainly, Pluto's entrance into Aquarius, even though it's a 2-year sort of process back and forth, but the idea that the Lord of the Underworld is showing us a couple of decades of a new paradigm, and that paradigm is driven by the archetype of Aquarius, which invented Zoom. Aquarius invented Zoom. He was up there going, "How can I connect people in a disconnected moment? How about through the ethers?"
The World Wide Web.
The World Wide Web, my invention. Thank you very much. It's an interesting thing to talk about what we leave behind in the old age, and that what we move towards in the age of Aquarius is driven by data technology and the ways that we connect that are sort of trans bodies or outside of the body. Hopeful? Fearful?
Yes. No. Well. So here's what I would say about that. Just because I know a lot of your listeners you've done such a beautiful job of informing people for years. That I found myself saying way back in 2005, but certainly around 2008, when Pluto first moved into Capricorn, I would start all of my lectures or sessions with the bad news is all the systems as we know are crumbling.
That's right.
The good news is that all the systems as we know them are crumbling.
That's right.
Right. And that's Pluto and Capricorn. So, and we're very wired. We're still very, very much wired. It's I would say young in a weird way, to the authoritarian system, the authority system, the structured system, the hierarchical system, where, and I learned this working with the military. I do this with organizations, that the more hierarchical it is, actually, the easier it is to hold each other accountable, because if you don't do a good job, you just get fired. and that the basis of the work I do at the Weston Network with companies is this idea of the more you want an inclusive work environment, the more you must build in respectful ways to hold each other accountable.
Right.
Because the system is no longer there to do that. So that becomes the individual, and the group becomes more responsible for creating that structure, the scaffolding to keep an organization or system going. That's very Aquarian.
Yes.
And so this idea of, now that we've been through the Pluto, of course, we're still going to cycle back and forth, but we're coming to the end of the structures that needed to die off, the old structures, the 20th century structures that are falling away. That's happening. And now we have to reinvent how we are with ourselves and each other. And that's what fierce civility is. It's creating, it offers a blueprint for lasting peace. And I would say that the approach I'm taking with that is that, as we're moving into this Aquarius phase, where Pluto's going to do what it's going to do in Pluto in Aquarius for many years, my emphasis is on, of course, the polar opposite, on Leo, on the heart.
Right.
So for me,
Beautiful.
it has to, so to create that, we first have to start with power within. Yes. Start with personal sovereignty, which is what I believe Leo is, right? And the cultivation of the heart that goes beyond our personal heart. It goes beyond it's a transcendent heart. And that's how individuals can step into a more evolved sense of community, which is what Aquarius, I believe, has to offer us.
That's right. And it's brilliant to bring in the power of the opposition, because there is no such thing as understanding a sign without understanding its polar opposite, because they're tethered together. And so it's sort of brilliant of you to sort of focus on Leo as the opposite of Aquarius, ruled by the sun and ruling the heart, as being the solution to what the Aquarius problem is seeking to solve. It's like Aquarius says, I'm going to solve the problem of community, and how I'm going to do that is with my opposite, Leo, in the heart.
And our own personal responsibility in that, right? The Leo responsibility.
That's right. Absolutely. Personal responsibility funneled into community efficacy.
Yeah.
So what is fierce civility, and who wants to read this book, and what's the value they're going to get?
Fierce civility, the subtitle is Transforming Our Global Culture from Polarization to Lasting Peace.
Beautiful.
And it offers a pathway of hope. And it's a system, that it's a book that it offers many teachings, many contemplations and practices to do this very thing of, what's your place in the world? How do you train yourself to first find your own internal power and find your way in this challenging time? And I reframe civility in a way where, because the old-fashioned notion of civility is not working, and it's never going to work. The level of lack of civility we're experiencing, and opposition,
Yes,
and
yes.
downright violence.
Yeah. Yeah.
This old idea of civility, very Victorian thing, is just not going to work. So how can we be fierce in our civility, and how can we be fierce in standing up for civility? So this idea of how can we become, many been metaphors I use. One is a midwives. How do we become midwives for a system that is dying and a new system that's emerging? This very moment, Pluto transitioning out of Capricorn into Aquarius. And the way we do that is that we train ourselves to be nurturers and protectors. That what if, and not only for at a larger scale, but for ourselves. How this offers ways for deeper levels of self-care where you can nurture and protect yourself, where you advocate for nurturing and protecting others, not only loved ones, but maybe adversaries and strangers, if
Yes,
that feels
gotcha.
safe for you, right? That's how we expand into the community, into the we. And most importantly, how do we train ourselves to nurture and protect the integrity of our conversations? So that because any conversation, because of the fight, flight, free response, if it's going to be with someone with different views, you're going to be uncomfortable. You're going to get triggered. And do you have the skills to be able to feel your feet on the ground, take that breath,
That's
regulate,
right. Not react.
and stay in it?
Present, heart open, and make a change.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Where can people find this book?
Well, you can find it on my website, joeweston.com, if you want to check that out to see more of what I'm doing. Also, of course, on Amazon, you can find it there.
Beautiful. Joe's work is fascinating, valuable, extraordinary, very different from mine. And I love that we wrapped it up through the lens of astrology. Thank you so much for coming on, Joe. Please get his
Thank you,
book,
Michael.
Fierce Civility, Joe Weston, joeweston.com. Check him out. And like I like to say, have at it.
Thank you for listening to Conscious Embodiment, Astrology and Dreams with Dr. Michael Lennox. You can find us on Apple Music, the iHeartRadio app, and anywhere you find your favorite shows. Head on over to michaellennox.com for information on astrology readings, the daily Astro Alert subscription, upcoming classes, and to join the mailing list.